2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, or in Russia's terms, engaged in a military operation in eastern Ukraine, many countries around the world sanctioned Russia. The United States, the United Kingdom, and many other G7 nations put massive sanctions on Russia. But the question remains is, do sanctions actually work? And do they pressure governments to actually change their public policies? There are widespread sanctions covering an array of different sectors, including finance, media, military, and many more. And many scholars say that sanctions work on the targeted country for a short period of time, but are less effective at actually changing that target country's public policies. If that country has a high risk tolerance, sanctions actually don't really work that well. Now, there are a variety of countries that the United States has placed sanctions on in the past, but one country I want to focus on is Iraq. After Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the United States engaged in many sanctions on Iraq, trying to pressure its government into stopping its current action in Kuwait. The sanctions froze Iraq's financial assets, suspended trade, and had a severe impact on its economy, its financial sector, its social and psychological repercussions for the country. There was even a temporary embargo that cost Iraq billions of dollars, leading to a depressed economy, a lower standard of living, and acute poverty. And this is just my opinion, but this really did lay the groundwork for more extremist movements to take root, like Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS. And the reason I say that is because once unemployment hits double digits or even high double digits for the young people in particular, young men become attracted to more extremist movements because they don't see that hope for them in their own country. But again, that's just my assessment of what happened in Iraq. And because the country is so dependent on oil, its revenues dropped dramatically in the 1990s and really pressured the government in changing some of its policies. As a result of those sanctions, it may have in fact have pressured Iraq to change its policies as well. Iraq's tolerance was perhaps lower than Russia's. But now I want to move on to Russia. Russia is a much different economy and a much different country than Iraq. Russia, for example, supplies 35 to 40% of the EU's total natural gas demand, as well around the same percentage for the EU's total oil demand. Russia also is a major contributor to the wheat and cereal markets for the rest of the world. In fact, Russia produces approximately 18% of the entire wheat supply for the world. And because of its geographical location, it finds a lot of markets like in Africa and other nations for those products that are heavily dependent on cereals and wheat as part of its diet. In fact, the average diet in Africa consists of 30 to 40% of cereal or wheat products, meaning that Russia's wheat production is absolutely essential to Africa. But another impact of the sanctions on Russia is the growth of the shadow trade, or the growth of Central Asian countries nearing Russia. In Central Asia, economic growth in 2022 exceeded expectations, increasing trade with Russia, as well as public sector wage hikes. Specifically, the economies of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan all grew during this period. And despite the potential negative impacts of sanctions, trade turnover between Russia and these Central Asian countries increased in 2022 compared to the previous year. Interestingly enough, these Central Asian countries did not condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. It didn't add to the chorus of other countries calling for Russia to remove itself from Ukraine. Instead, they abstained from various United Nations votes on Russia's engagement in Ukraine. And the South Caucasus countries like Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan displayed resilience in responding to these sanctions. All three countries avoided radical measures and maintained diplomatic flexibility. Georgia opposed economic sanctions in Russia, citing national interest. Armenia recorded a significant rise in trade with Russia, and Azerbaijan strengthened its position in the European energy market. So while G7 nations have condemned Russia for its actions in Ukraine, this actually has spawned increased economic growth in Central Asian countries because they neither condemn nor condone Russia, but also see the value strategically of Russia from an economic perspective. Another impact the sanctions on Russia have is food insecurity in Africa. 30 to 40% of the average diet in Africa consists of wheat and cereal, and many countries get their wheat and cereal products from both Ukraine and Russia, 50 to 60% on average, but some countries like Somalia and Benin get 100% of their cereal and wheat products from Russia and Ukraine. Because of the sanctions, the prices of wheat and cereal have been driven up approximately 74% since 2022 in Africa. Now, what this means for the average family in Africa could be that the most vulnerable populations in Africa are no longer able to afford staples necessary to their diets as a result of these sanctions. As well, the hard part about all of this is that while Africa does produce cereal and wheat products, it is nowhere near the demand for cereal and wheat products in local economies. And that means that that shortfall needs to be imported. And the closest geographical partner is Russia and Ukraine. And because of the war and these sanctions, the prices have been driven up, and many African countries are facing a massive shortfall in wheat and cereal. I haven't really talked about natural gas dependency by the EU, but it's absolutely vital, and Russia knows this. Despite what many think as a phasing out of fossil fuels, Vladimir Putin knows that that's going to take many decades, if not a generation or two. The reality is dependency on fossil fuels will remain for the foreseeable future, and natural gas is absolutely essential to heating homes throughout Europe. Russia does not face the economic shocks, perhaps, that Iraq faced in the 1990s. Russia has strategic partners in Central Asia whose economies are very dependent on what they can produce as well. Russia knows that it can still attain 35 to 40% of all of the EU's natural gas demands. And that'll be there for the foreseeable future. And Russia's sectors in natural gas, oil, wheat, and cereal are very well established and well developed. And while the EU could potentially go to Nigeria for some natural gas, it knows that it'll take time for Nigeria to ramp up production to meet what Russia could give the EU right now. I feel like Vladimir Putin and Russia are playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers, it seems. Vladimir Putin knows the economic strategic power that Russia has both in Central Asia, Africa, and the EU. And despite the sanctions that are being placed on Russia, we're coming up to the 2-year mark of the war, and it seems like they're withstanding the shock and awe of those sanctions initially. And if this is indeed a wait-and-see approach from Russia, should we not as countries ask our governments, why are we putting so many sanctions on a country that have other reverberating effects to other countries and continents like Africa, and more importantly, may not be providing any deterrent to Russia changing its policy in Ukraine? But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Do you think sanctions are effective? Do you think they're efficient? Do you think they are the best way and best method countries like the United States, the UK, and others can pressure Russia from getting out of Ukraine? Let me know what you think in the comment section below.